I remember you went on vacation after the Quiz Show Expo, and I can't remember where it was exactly. How was that?
Yes, I actually, well, it wasn't quite a vacation so much as a working vacation, I guess. I went on a bit of a book tour promoting my new book, With Love, Mommie Dearest, The Making of an Unintentional Camp Classic, a book about the making of that movie, the famous Faye Dunaway, 1981 drama / laugh riot, depending on how you look at it. So I was in Chicago, in Peoria, in Des Moines, Iowa, and a few other areas of the Midwest. I'm returning to the Midwest in September for the Printers Row Book Fair in Chicago and going to a few additional cities promoting that book. And, so I'm just, and then working on additional books that hopefully will see the light of day in the next year and two.
Yeah, looking forward to those as well. It's an honor to have author A. Ashley Hoff. He's the author of the book Match Game 101, a backstage history of Match Game, and his newest book that just came out is With Love, Mommie Dearest, the making of an unintentional camp classic. Ashley, thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, tell us about your background and how you got into writing.
I had worked I was a theater major in college, but that segued into first starting as an intern and then later working at a couple of talent agencies, first in Chicago and then later in Los Angeles. And so basically I, decided acting was not necessarily for me per se, so I channeled all, my interest in that into the agency side of things. But then during the course of that, I discovered I really don't like offices all that much. And following career advice given to me by Charo, I followed my true interest, which was writing. Even though it was writing about the entertainment industry, I started writing a book on Match Game, basically because I had known a couple of people who worked on the show. One in particular was Kay Henley, who was celebrity coordinator on the 70s version of Match Game. And because I was always a fan of the show, they reran it to death at that time on the Game Show Network, and then later on Buzzer, and of course put out DVDs of it and that sort of thing. And it was something where I basically said to Kay, you should write a book about your years working on the show because I would buy it. She basically said she didn't want to, but she said, if you want to write a book, I'll gladly talk to you for it. And so it grew out of that. I interviewed her about her experiences and everything that she did and all the people that she'd worked with, both behind the scenes as well as, of course, all the celebrity panelists, both the regulars as well as the guests and the recurring characters, Betty White and Fannie Flagg and Patty Deutsch, etc. And I was very lucky because having worked in talent agencies, I had access to a lot of the people who at that time were still with us. I wrote Match Game 101 largely between 2002 and 2005. And I was very lucky I was able to track people down. This was before Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So because of working with the talent agencies, I was able to reach people either through the unions, through their own respective agencies, and sometimes because people like Kay Henley kept in touch with a number of people. She put me in touch, for instance, with Scoey Mitchell and a few other people that I couldn't track down through conventional means. And so I was very, very lucky. People were open to talking to me about their experiences working on the Match Game panel as well as behind the scenes. It was funny because whenever I would mention the show to people, they'd give a little laugh, but then they'd, start smiling. what struck me was the fact that, despite all the rumors about, certain of the panelists being difficult or not necessarily getting along with each other, nobody really trashed each other, and nobody really trashed the show. To me, everybody spoke very fondly of their time working on the show. Everybody spoke very fondly of the game itself. And even if they did not always see eye to eye with their co-celebrity panelists or whomever, everybody was pretty kind. Brett Summers was not someone to pull any punches, and she was not exactly Richard Dawson's best friend, and vice versa. But she was the first one to tell me, he was a great game player. He really cared passionately about the contestants winning, and 9.5 times out of 10, he matched them perfectly. He was very skilled and adept at reading the contestants to figure out their likeliest answers and match them. So there was a great deal of, as far as I could tell, it was a very happy set, and everybody really seemed to have a genuine respect for each other and for the genre.
And that's great. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I went to Cantor's Delicatessen about, 5 or 6 years ago and spoke with Gary Cantor, the grandson of the founder. Gary has since passed away. But he told me that during the heyday of Richard Dawson's Family Feud, that usually at least 2 or 3 times a month, Dawson would order his staff of Family Feud free lunch from Cantor's. And so that was really cool to hear about that. And then, like you said, Dawson always had the contestant's best interest in mind. Even the last episode that he was ever on, when the contestant got the $500 response in the super match, which he gave, you saw that big grin on his face, during that time and stuff. So that was really neat. And I remember Charles Nelson Riley being on Larry King Live, and he said, "Yeah, Brett and I are great friends. Yeah, we were always insulting each other on Match Game, but that was more of an act than, the real thing."
Well, I remember telling Brett, and I was joking, of course, but I said that she and Charles should both co-star in a bus and truck revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And she just laughed. "Oh, Ashley, I could never remember all those lines." But she knew exactly what I meant, and she knew that she and Charles bickering and bantering was half the fun of the show.
It was, yeah. I mean, just it was like they were like these sibling rivalry almost, if you can, or an unhappy couple that just can't stay each other, so they're just airing all their dirty laundry out in the open.
Well, and of course, it was all just playing it, for the cameras. It was all just fun, playful teasing and that sort of thing. But I think one of the things that was a real selling point of Match Game in particular, game shows in general, Match Game in particular, was the fact that in the years before reality television as we know it today, talk shows like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and game shows like Match Game were really about the only places that you were able to see celebrities, quote unquote, being themselves, because they were unscripted. They might have an idea of certain things they would be talking about. For instance, if they were being interviewed by Johnny on The Tonight Show, but on something like a game show like Match Game or other game shows like Pyramid, there really is no way to fake your responses or how good you are at the game or how bad you are at the game, or you got to see people how they really were. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that Match Game was such a big draw, remains so today, is because it was really, you got to see people's real personalities. And that was a very novel, interesting thing,
Yeah, it was interesting meeting Joyce Bielefon at the Quiz Show Expo last month, actually about a month ago. And, she was the same person in the flesh as she was on TV. It was not a put on at all. It was like, she's just as sweet in person as she was on TV.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's really no way you can fake it for the cameras. I mean, you can fake it a little bit, but if you match a contestant and that joy is, whether it is because it's relief that you actually matched, or whether it's genuine joy, that this contestant won some money. Those are genuine emotions. And if you see someone who's just, a bit brittle or a bit reserved or a bit whatever, you can't fake that either. Sometimes that's born out of shyness as opposed to any kind of, they have a difficult personality. But you just got a real feel for who these people were. And one of the things that was really delightful about the actors and actresses of that era, the heyday of Match Game was, up the 70s into the early 80s, is the fact that actors and actresses of that time period were really bred to be raconteurs. They were really gifted storytellers. They were usually very good at improvisation. Gene Rayburn, who hosted Match Game, both the original 60s version as well as the later, classic 70s run, he came from radio and morning, especially helped create the morning talk show radio format that we know today. Mm-hmm. And it's because he was trained in radio and because actors and actresses like Brett Summers and Jack Klugman started in live television in New York in the 50s and early 60s. These people basically, or theater, the majority of them, started in theater as well as live television. And so they were really very gifted at improv, at making up something as it goes along. If some unexpected thing happened, like, the set fell apart, a set piece did not work, or there would be something, rather than, have Ira Scutch, who was the producer, or director Mark Breslow, yell cut, and then stop and then fix everything and then go back and do reshoots. They just simply went with it. They just acted like, okay, this is part of the show, so here we are. And they would play along with it. Sometimes they'd turn it into a comedy bit that would run throughout that episode. And it's because they all had these great instincts. They just were able to bounce back no matter what you threw at them. And that was part of the charm. I mean, we all wish that we were as clever and as witty and as fun as these people really genuinely were.
Yeah, it was interesting is because most of the stars on Match Game were not the stars of their TV shows. They were the co-stars. And oftentimes the co-stars do better at the game shows than the big stars themselves, which I thought was pretty interesting. But it makes sense for some reason.
Yeah. And a lot of times those second bananas are much more versatile, both as personalities as well as, types, acting types. So they were really gifted with playing along with whatever was happening on the show. And that's one of the reasons that Match Game, Gene Rayburn would always joke, this is a lousy game. It's a lousy format. And he wasn't entirely wrong. I mean, it was fun to play up the self-deprecation. But he recognized the fact that Match Game was a fun show, but really the game itself took second place to, the chattering and the bickering and the bantering among the celebrity panel, or between the panel and Gene, or between the panel and the contestant,
I think about the episode they have where he's like, hello, stars. Hello, Gene. Hello. No answer. I guess we got no stars.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were playful, fun personalities. It was a playful, fun format. I think Match Game kind of brought the best out of everybody, or certainly made them all look their best.
Oh, yeah. Earl, the stagehand who Gene would oftentimes refer to, did you get to meet him as well?
Earl Wilson, I so wanted to meet him. I worked like hell trying to track him down, but nobody really knew, but everybody had presumed that he had passed before I had started the book, because I was trying, at CBS Television City, which is where they taped Match Game. He had been a longtime stagehand there. Most of the crew members were longtime workers at CBS Television City, and they'd work on various TV shows, not just Match Game. Earl was one of these people, and he had an extensive resume. People spoke very fondly of him, and they remembered him and knew him in their day-to-day lives, but there wasn't a lot of, they didn't necessarily go to each other's houses for dinner and that sort of thing. They just knew each other on the set, and so they were, friendly acquaintances and that sort of thing, but I wasn't really able to discover his real life story. I was hoping I could. I devoted an entire chapter of Match Game 101 to him and to, the other crew members who most of the time don't really get a lot of recognition.
Yeah, but they are such a big part of it. Speaking of challenges, who was the biggest challenge to find in regards to the people that you interviewed?
That's hard to say. Again, I wrote the book largely between 2002 and 2005, so this is before social media took off on the Internet. To track people down, I basically took up stalking as a hobby. Aside from tracking people down through, unions and, the usual polite avenues, sometimes when I couldn't track people down or they had long since retired, I would basically, if I saw that somebody was performing in town, maybe at Theater West or one of the local plays, I would literally be a stage door Johnny hanging around, the back door when they came out and, hit them up for an interview then. That's what I did with Lee Merriweather and a few other people that I interviewed for the book. The hardest to find, I think was probably Scully Mitchell, because he had retired by the time I wrote the book, but he had also by that point, he started as a comedian, so he was on stage, he was on stage and on screen, but he had sometime in the 70s started producing, and by like the 80s and 90s, he'd really focused on producing. So I wasn't able to track him down through the usual means. And I had called up, Kay Henley, and we were talking at one point, and she was asking, how's the book going? And I said, oh, yeah, no. I let her know how it was going and said, there's one person in particular I've been trying to track down, and I just can't find him, and that's Scully Mitchell. She said, oh, I've got his phone number right here. And she gave me his phone number. And so, it took like a couple of years and then 30 seconds for me to track down Scully Mitchell and call him up. And we ended up having this long, hour and a half long interview, just conversation. Mm-hmm. And he shared, basically his life story and his career story, as well as his memories of working on Match Game. He loved working with Brett Charles. He loved the people. And it was a great interview. And that was, I was so lucky because people were so responsive in a positive way. When I was tracking down people like Dr. Joyce Brothers, who had done a certain amount of acting and making appearances on talk shows and sometimes guest shots on a television show. But she had also graced the Match Game panel. She was also on the 60s version of Match Game. And I was able to track her down and talk with her, and she very generously talked about it and spoke very highly of the show. She had liked Gene Rayburn. She had liked the people that she was on with on the panel, and she enjoyed games and puzzles and that sort of thing. And it was very interesting to me to talk to a lot of these people who worked on the show and learn that one of the joys for them was not just you know, the coworkers or the cast and crew members, but also the fact that they themselves were fans of the game show or of games in general. People like Betty White talked about how she grew up with her parents sitting around the dining room table playing word games and that sort of thing. So she was always a game player, and a lot of these people were. It's very interesting. They were fans of the format, not just stars of it.
We're in conversation with A. Ashley Hoff. He's the author of Match Game 101. And next time he discusses more stories about the celebrities he interviewed, as well as some international celebrities from versions around the world.